Sixers. Today we're going to look at the comparative lifestyles of the typical patrician and typical plebeian living in ancient Rome. And we're going to see that there is a huge amount of economic inequality between the patricians and the plebeians, especially as the Roman Empire gains more power, more wealth. The patricians continue to grow and their wealth and their opulence, and the plebeians get poorer and poorer, and that eventually is going to be a problem. But in order to try to keep the plebeian class peaceful, they go through another number of measures, including supplying them food and trying to distract them with gladiatorial combat and chariot races and all the fun of the circus. Not the fun clown kind. Not that there's ever fun with clowns, but, that type of circus. It's different. So let's get into it, shall we? So, typical patrician lived a life of leisure. Ooh la la. Because there's so much slave labor, they don't have to pay for a labor force to do their work, to keep their businesses going. So they pretty much have a free ride. They make money. All the work is done for people who have to work for free or they die. And in return, all the money that they're making from the empire and their businesses and work, they get to live really comfortably. If you look over on this side, you'll see that there's a picture of a typical patrician house. You might notice, that's a water. Patricians had baths often in their house. There's also public baths, but they would have a bath in their house with, yes, warm and cold water. They would have large facilities, courtyards. They lived decadently. Here you see a patrician woman being tended to by a whole group of slaves. We talked about how patricians would travel and walk with their slaves with them at all times so they could show off their wealth. Slaves for them were the Mercedes, the Lamborghini of their time period. And they also would try to show off in their clothing, wore a lot of jewelry, and like to buy stuff from Far East. The Silk Road brought a lot of things that were very valuable to the Romans that were not available in Europe or the Mediterranean world, namely silk, but also spices and many other things. And on top of this, they kept building more and more and more large villas, like the one that you see here, large temples, large palaces, and it keeps eating up more and more and more of the land of Rome. Well, the population of Rome keeps going up and up and up. We're talking about a population well over 1 million people during the height of the Roman Empire that are squeezed into an 8 square mile area. And the patricians own most of it. That means that most of the population is squeezed into very small areas. And as a result, the patricians just are drains. They suck away the financial, the natural, and the land resources. They take the most, even though they are the smallest group. And the opposite side of this, the plebeians, well, they don't live so great. And we're going to see for the average plebeian, since most of the resources are going to a small group, most of the people have very little. Rome was a pretty dangerous place for being such an advanced city in its time period. Murder, theft, crime were really high on the streets of Rome. Malnourishment was very common among the plebeians. Not having enough food. Homelessness was very common. Here we see a man in ancient Rome living in a giant clay pot. But most people lived in almost tenement style apartment buildings that were 3 to 4 stories tall, made out of concrete, that they were stacked on top of one another. Fires were very common. It was not generally a great life for the plebeians. So if you are most of the people and you have nothing, and a small group of the people have everything, you might think that that large group of people might say, maybe we should rise up against the patricians. They're taking everything, yet they're small. Maybe since we're so big in population, we can overwhelm them. Well, the patricians fear this all the time, and they feel that they need to keep them happy. There's a quote in the reading from Discovery, I believe from Plutarch, that talked about that the plebeians need to be made happy with bread and circuses. So basically, we need to keep them satisfied with enough food so that they're not hungry. They're not going to have an abundance, but that they're not starving to death. People who are starving are willing to revolt in order to stop that. So make sure they have enough food, and also distract them, and not really focus on how badly they're being treated. So the first part comes with the satisfaction with food, and since the Romans had such a large empire, controlled such a vast amount of territory, they funneled large amounts of grain into Rome. In fact, it would become one of the military's number one priorities is to get enough grain to feed 200,000 people daily. 200,000 people got their everyday nourishment from the Roman government, in order to keep them going. Why they need the food? Well, they couldn't work because their jobs were taken by slaves, and if they're not working and they're not making money, they need to eat. So this is a way of keeping these people, the quote mob, as the patricians often refer to them, to keep them satisfied. We're going to see that especially Egypt will become very crucial. We talked about how much of an abundance of food is grown in Egypt, and the Romans will use that food to pretty much that they get from Egypt to feed the masses in their city. But the other way is to keep them distracted, and that was with the circuses. Now, we're not talking about, circuses with clowns and stuff like that. The circus was a theater in the round, a round arena, although oftentimes they were oval shaped. The Colosseum, seen here, one of the most famous buildings of the ancient world. Here you see what it looks like today, what it looked like back then. And the Circus Maximus are both ovular arenas. They weren't circles, but an oval does have a round shape. These were used for a lot of things. They could be used for theatrical performances, parades, but for the most part, they were used for violent sport. The people of Rome loved watching violence. It was a way that they would be distracted from the tough things that are going on in their everyday life by focusing on the actions that were taking place, oftentimes 100 times a year in the Colosseum, often 100 times a year in the Circus Maximus, to keep them focused on other things. Probably the most recognizable symbol of ancient Rome is the Colosseum. This is kind of a cut-in section of what it looked like during its heyday. It was built out of concrete and stone. It was built sturdily. Good portions of it still stand today. It's definitely not intact as it was back then. It is definitely a bit broken up through wars and many other things, but a good chunk of it's still around, even though it's close to 2,000 years old. In its heyday, it could hold over 50,000 people. They figure, Giant Stadium right by our house. I'm sorry, MetLife Stadium right by our house can hold about 50,000 too, but all those people are paying customers. In the Coliseum, the entrance was free. Now you definitely had what like almost the equivalent today in our stadiums of skybox seating that were reserved for the richest, the aristocrats, the emperor. They all had their reserved spots, but the masses were able to go to this, and it was free. So getting to go to this big event was a big deal, and it was something that the Romans really fixated on. Roman children played with clay figurines of gladiators. Even some of the more famous and successful gladiators would do endorsements like our athletes of today. It's pretty crazy. Who put this all together? Well, you would have smaller gladiatorial matches throughout the empire that would be paid for and organized by rich members of the patrician class. But the Colosseum in Rome, that was paid for by the emperor himself as a gift to the Roman people, but also as a way of like gaining their favor. Like, hey, the emperor's cool. He put on this big show for us. If you look along here, the velarium sounds like veil. Same root, Latin. The velarium would hang over the top of the arena to keep everybody in the shade on sunny days. So they didn't have a dome roof, but that's pretty close. And they also, if you look down here, had massive underground complexes underneath that included housing for gladiators, over 30 different trap doors that could spring up in matches that had even, animals that would come out of them, special effects, all sorts of things. These are a lot like, if you think of like pro wrestling matches today with all the different special effects. And my favorite had a massive irrigation and drainage system. They could fill the floor of the stadium with 5 feet of water. And they would have naval battle reenactments where they'd reenact famous Navy battles from history. And just like the real battles in history, these were deadly and violent. In fact, why don't we explore a little bit more about what the Colosseum was like, and especially with their use of the Navy battles, which to me is just a crazy feature